Let's be real, the A7 IV is going to be an exciting camera for all of us when that comes out. And before you kind of try to debate with me and argue with me that the A7 IV might not even come out anyway, just look at the market segment that the A7 III filled in 2018, and then you look at that market now. At that price range, the A7 III is far behind, and there's no way Sony will let themselves lag behind in a camera segment, especially one of the most popular ones, which is about the 2,000 to 3,000 USD full frame mirrorless market. The A7 III was the camera that kind of sent Sony to the top because it was the first really refined package that had great autofocus and Ibis and good battery life and dual card slots and decent color all at one go, and it had great video and photo specs. It was an excellent hybrid choice. So the A7 III was clearly like a very important camera for Sony. It's the reason they're the kings today, because this was the first full frame mirrorless camera that was really a solid all-round package, and it came first to the scene. And not only did they come first to the scene, they provided a lot of value by basically giving you the specs of a 5D Mark IV, but at the price of like 2,000 something USD, which was very immense. So the A7 III is important, and it's inevitable that A7 IV is going to come out. So let's use a bit of logic, a bit of rational reasoning to kind of figure out where the A7 IV might land in terms of its specs and kind of its performance. Because I think, you know, the rumors that actually are accurate at the end of the day only come out like a few weeks before the product actually arrives on the market. So at that point, it's quite useless. But using a bit of rationality and a bit of logical guess, but we can kind of figure out where the A7 IV would land, at least as a baseline. So if someone was thinking, hey, should I change my A7 III to a Panasonic S5? If someone was thinking if they wanted to buy a EOS R6 or wait for the next A7 IV, they can kind of gauge whether the improvements in specs and stuff will be worth it, just with a bit of rational logic, whether the wait will be worth it or not. So let's talk about the A7 IV and where I think it's going to end up using logic. Now, if you know basic kind of maths and graphs and stuff, the basic idea is that when you want to plot some sort of trend, you're going to need 3 points. 2 points to get a line, but you put 3 points so you can ensure that the line is indeed a straight line, and you can plot a proper trend that way. And the 3 points of data I'm going to use is, one, how Sony acted with the launch of the A7 III, so the way they kind of viewed the market, the way they released the A7 III, and the way the whole purpose of the A7 III as a product when it was released back then is number one. The second data point I want to look at is how Sony, what Sony has been doing recently. So with the A7S III, the A1s and the A7R4, like with their recent releases, what has the trends been? Like, are they aggressively attacking the market? Or are they trying to sneak certain niches in there? You know, we're going to look at it from that perspective as a second data point. And for the data point, I want to look at Sony's A7 III competition in the past, how Sony reacted to its competition in the past, and how Sony is going to react to the competition now, and kind of the cameras that are likely going to be in the price range of the predicted A7 IV. Like, what are the cameras that the A7 IV is likely going to be competing with, and, you know, how has Sony reacted to its competition in the past relative to its, like, you know, competitors' products? Like, how did they respond to their competitors' products in the past? So let's use those 3 data points and let's get into it. So the first data point is the A7 III. How did Sony treat the A7 III? So Sony treated the A7 III clearly as a trailblazing product. Not only did they put everything they could in it at that point in time, they also kind of put it in a very aggressive price. Remember, 5D Mark IV performance at 2,300 USD, which was, I think, about 1,000 less than the 5D Mark IV. So with the A7 III, they were very clearly, you know, gunning to be the first in the market and also be kind of the first benchmark refined full frame mirrorless camera in the market, which they were, because they came before the EOS R, they came before the Z6 and Z7 really gained kind of popularity. They came before the Panasonic S1, S1H, and the S5. So with the A7 III, Sony was clearly trying to release something that was very well refined and very high quality before anyone else, and they clearly did that. And not only did they try to do it before everyone else, they tried to do it at a very aggressive price. A price that, you know, the Nikon Z6 couldn't really match, the price that the EOS R couldn't really match, and the price that the Panasonic S1 couldn't really match at launch. Of course, the kind of prices have kind of gone down, and the A7 III is, I think, about 2,000 USD now, and the EOS R and other competitors have kind of ended up at about that same price range nowadays. But, you know, the A7 III was very aggressive with its pricing from the get-go. It was very aggressive from many aspects from the get-go. So as a result, it was something that really helped Sony grab as much market share as they could at the start, before full frame mirrorless really became a bustling market like it is today. So Sony's intention with the A7 III was clearly to grab market share when it was still hot and fresh of the DSLR paint trade. So what then will the A7 IV be? Now the market is much more defined, much more mature now in terms of full frame mirrorless. Every camera except the Panasonics have excellent autofocus. All of them have pretty good Ibis, respectable, at least better than the A7 III usually. And they all have pretty good colors, better than the A7 III. Even the A7C, the A7 III's kind of cousin or slight facelift, has better color than the A7 III. So a lot of them have flip screens, a lot of them have easier to use menus and better touch screens. So that's kind of what the market has become. And a lot of them have 10-bit video in some way, shape or form, and some of them have high frame rate 4K, be it with a crop or not. So the A7 III has clearly lagged behind, and I think what the A7 IV is going to be is, unlike the A7 III, it's not going to be grab market share as much as we can before everything becomes mature kind of product. It's going to be more of a maintain the A7 III customer base product, as well as snagging a little few customers from, say, Panasonic, or snagging a few customers from Canon. How so? Well, I think the A7 IV is just going to be as good as the products at its price range from Canon or Panasonic, but with more refinement. So the R6 biggest drawback, overheating. The A7 IV would definitely not overheat because Sony does not want to, we will want to beat Canon in that one small aspect. And then with the Panasonic S5, Sony has the advantage of autofocus. So if Sony can match the Panasonic S5 in all aspects and beat them in autofocus, they would clearly win. So I think the A7 IV will be a camera that is really just to maintain the market share that A7 III got them as a brand. Make sure that the people don't get tempted to switch over to Canon or Panasonic or something else, and make sure, and for the little shortcomings of Canon, for the little shortcomings of Panasonic or Nikon, maybe steal a few customers here and there, but nothing too aggressive, nothing to really shake up the market. I doubt that the A7 IV would really try to come in and really shake everything up, because we move on to our next data point, which shows us that Sony more recently has been more careful in not disrupting the rest of its product stack, which means that the A7 IV won't be able to shake out the market, because if the A7 IV was to really shake up the market, it will have to have features that would match the A7S III or even the A1 in certain ways. So really high frame rates in terms of still photography, like 20-30 FPS photos on the photo side. It will need to have really high megapixels or something to really shake up the market, and it also will need to do like 4K 100 FPS to really shake up the market. And that is unlikely to happen, because if you look at Sony's recent X, they've been more careful with how they tread in terms of like, hey, this camera does that, this camera does that. Like with the A7R IV, they didn't upgrade the video specs because they clearly want the A7R IV to be a pure video camera, pure photo camera. With the A7S III, they were very careful not to make it good at all in terms of still photography, so that the A1 has space to shine. No 8K video on the A7S III for that reason almost. They've been very careful to kind of create each market segment for each product, and I think Sony has started to become slightly Canon-esque in that way by being more careful with the product releases, making sure everyone has their own little lane to chill in. So I think the A7 IV is going to be very good. It's definitely going to be very good as competitors, right? But it will not be A7S III level video. It will not be A1 level sports photography. I don't even think it will match the A9 Mark II, because if the A7 Mark IV did match the A9 Mark II, the kind of space where a possible A9 Mark III would fit will be very hard to find. Like if an A7 IV is as good as the A9 Mark II, I think an A9 Mark III will find it very hard to exist, because then you'll have to exist between an A1 and the A7 Mark IV in terms of sports photography. So I think in many aspects, the A7 IV is going to be it's just going to be comfortably above the A7C, which I'm sure we'll see a price drop once the A7 IV comes out. It will be comfortably there. It will be comfortably as good, if not, except better in some aspects than its competitors. And it will be comfortably below the A7R IV and the A7R5, whenever that comes out, and then it will be comfortably below the A7S III. It will be comfortably below the A1. You know, everyone will have its own lane, everyone have its own role, like a well-oiled functioning capitalist machine. So like if you look at what Sony's done recently with the FX3, FX6, FX9, like they've had very clear distinctions with their product lineups. They don't have, they clearly aren't doing the throw everything that you can at the product thing that they were doing with the A7R2 and the A7S2 and the A7 III, where they were clearly trying to get as many people on board, as many people on the mirrorless full frame game as they can before the DSLR makers decide to swap over. So unlike the A7R2 and A7S2 and A7 III that somehow all had the same exact video specs while still doing kind of excellent photos in their own way, like where, you know, those products will literally, you know, at that point in time in the past, Sony used to just give whatever they have, you know, the best they could on offer literally to you in the form of their products. I think that has changed and Sony is a bit more careful now. So I do not expect the A7 IV to really shake up the market, because looking at what Sony's been doing recently, they've been more respectful of their whole product lineup, how they kind of work together, how they kind of live alongside each other, cohabit. I don't know what's the right word with each other. Coexist with each other. So I think the A7 IV will be excellent. It should be a really good camera because Sony knows what they're doing, but I don't think it will be something that shaped up the market like the A7 III, which was really Sony throwing everything at the wall to try to get market share. Now the third data point is, what are the competitors doing? So we're going to use the first two data points, which is which kind of tells us how Sony will react relative to its competition and relative to itself. And now we're going to actually put in some numbers in the form of its competitors' performance in terms of its own kind of group members, its own family members kind of specs, and then we're going to use it to kind of figure out what exactly the specs are there. So like put it in the calculator and figure it out. So first thing, let's talk about the megapixel count. It's going to be at least 30 to 32 megapixels. Why do I say this? Because number one, they can't just release a camera that has the same exact number of megapixels as the A7 III and expect A7 III photography only users to want to upgrade. They need to give the A7 III users a reason to upgrade. So I suspect what is going to happen is they're going to have a backside illuminated sensor that's 32 megapixels. It's a nice healthy upgrade over the A7 III, so that, you know, there's a reason for A7 III users to get, but it's not so big that it will have terrible file sizes. It's not so high res that it will hurt the business of the A7R3 and A7R4 and maybe the next A7R5. So I think 30 to 32 megapixels would be a sweet spot. And to keep A7 III users happy in terms of like dynamic range, Sony will probably have excellent kind of R&D and put a lot of money into making sure that the A7 IV, this higher megapixel count, does not lose out in terms of dynamic range relative to the A7 III. At least that's my prediction. Another reason I say that the A7 IV will have 30 to 32 megapixels is because the only other sensor competitor, mind you, the A7 III sensor is found on the Nikon Z6, the Leica SL, and the Sigma FP, and the Panasonic S1, S1H, and S5. So yes, the A7 III sensor is everywhere. The only other competitor in terms of sensor to the A7 III sensor was really the EOS R sensor, and that was a 30 megapixel sensor. Sure, some people argue that the EOS R6 is the replacement to the EOS R, but looking at the rumors kind of circulating, I think there will be an EOS R replacement that isn't the EOS R6. So Sony would clearly, you know, want to release a camera that had that insurance. You know, if a EOS R replacement does come along that isn't the R6, the probability that it has similar megapixel count to the EOS R will be pretty high. So Sony putting a 32 megapixel sensor in there in the A7 IV would just make perfect sense. It would just be better than the EOS R. Just for insurance, it will be a healthy upgrade over the A7 III, so that there's reason for people to upgrade. And then, you know, it's going to still retain a lot of the beauty of the A7 III sensor, which is excellent dynamic range and excellent low light performance, which is definitely going to stay. Now, as for the sensor, it's definitely going to have Ibis. This, without a shadow of a doubt, it's going to have active stabilization and catalyst browse support. This is the kind of thing that it's expected. You know, Sony's been putting it on every new camera since it came out as a feature. So no worries about those things. It will have excellent autofocus. I suspect the same exact autofocus system you find on the A1 and the A7S III. And in terms of like the autofocus controls, it's going to be touchscreen. And since we're on the topic of touchscreen, the menu system is without a shadow of a doubt going to be the same as the A7S III and A7 8 and the Sony A1. Now, this is where it gets kind of confusing. Will Sony put a flip screen on the A7 IV? So, what I think is going to happen with the A7 IV is that there might actually be an A7C Mark II that's released alongside it. Now, this might be a bit far-fetched, okay, because now I'm suggesting another camera model be released, especially a sequel to something that only really came out recently. But it would make sense that a A7C is released for someone who wants a flip screen to take selfies as an all-round camera for both vlogging, video, photo, travel. And then Sony would release a very serious professional focus camera that will be an excellent B cam to the Sony A1, with a tilt-up screen for people who are only going to use the camera behind, the camera and then never going to point the camera at themselves. For me, I think that makes good sense that there might be an A7 IV and an A7C Mark II, where it's kind of like the way things are now, where it's one's a flip screen and more vlog friendly, and then the other one's more serious with the A7 III. This might be a stretch, but I think that is entirely possible. Another thing that could happen is just Sony puts a flip screen on the A7 IV and calls it a day, which is honestly more likely to happen because it's a simpler guess. But if Sony does put that flip out screen on the side for their kind of A7 Mark IV, I think a lot of the photographers will be unhappy. So it's kind of like up in the air exactly on this feature. I'm not too sure. I'm not going to make any guesses. But I think since Sony will be basing the A7 IV on what the competitor has done, and the biggest competitor for the A7 IV is likely going to be the R6 and the S5, there will be a tilty flippy screen just because competition. You need to match the competition. Okay, next up, let's talk about like kind of still FPS features that I guess will come along. So it's definitely going to match. It's definitely going to be an upgrade over the A7 III. And the A7 III can do, I think, 10 FPS with autofocus and 20 FPS without autofocus. So I'm sure that number will be bumped up to 15 to 20 FPS with autofocus. And with the megapixel upgrade, that will be actually a two-way upgrade. Like, not only are you getting faster stills with the A7 IV, that's my guess at least, and you're probably also going to get higher megapixel, faster stills with the A7 IV. But, whatever. The A7 IV, without a shadow of a doubt, I swear to God, if it doesn't have it, I'll do a giveaway of the A7 III. But the A7 IV will definitely have a CF Express Type A card slot that's also a hybrid SD card slot, because it's a part that's used by the A1 and A7S III, and it makes no sense for Sony to not use that as well in the A7 Mark IV. So it's definitely going to have that. It's going to have a headphone jack, it's going to have a mic jack, it's going to have, hopefully, a slightly bigger than micro HDMI port. It's definitely going to have USB-C charging support. And it's going to have the new hot shoes that support those digital audio things that are super, super duper fancy and all that stuff. So those are certain predictions that are definitely going to be there. So what else? Let's go. So those are some of the predictions that are pretty safe. Let's talk about video specs now, because I think that's where the biggest growth is to be had in the mirrorless game still. Because photo specs, let's be honest, you can shoot photos with a Canon 60D and still shoot, you can still shoot with like a journalist award-winning prize photos with an old camera. You can. So photography specs not too important. I think video specs is where the A7 IV is something that like people will get excited by. I'm gonna make this prediction right here. The A7 IV is not gonna have 4K 120 FPS. Seriously, it's not. At most, like if Sony were kind, they will put like 4K 80 FPS, but I don't think that will happen. I think Sony will just put a 4K 60 FPS full frame on the A7 IV and call it a day. Why? Because if you look at its competition, none of its competition really give 4K 60p that is very usable. That's full frame, The EOS R6 overheats once you try to shoot 4K 60p for too long. The Sony, the Panasonic S5 has a 1.5 times crop and only does 10-bit 420 with 4K 60 on the Panasonic S5. I'm sure Sony will put 10-bit 422 full frame with the Sony A7 IV 4K 60. And if you look at kind of, I think the Nikon Z6 Mark II and Z5 Mark II, they do 4K 60, but they also do it with a crop. So I think Sony would really just cap the A7 Mark IV at 4K 60, 422 10-bit full frame internal, which frankly isn't the worst thing in the world. I don't think that is too much of a concern. I really think 4K 60 is all you need. 100 FPS isn't the most important thing in the world, but I think it will definitely have 4K. It will definitely have 1080p 200 FPS, because a sensor that can read out that much data of 4K 60 can technically do 1080p 240 FPS if you just do the math. Now the only question is this: will Sony be too scared of a possible X-T5 coming out? Because an X-T5 coming out would definitely mean an APS-C camera with 4K 120 FPS. But like, without a doubt, the X-T5 would have 4K 120 FPS, because they would need to compete with the best of Sony, because X-T5 is the best of Fuji. So the only question is, will Sony be scared of an X-T5 coming out and put 120 FPS on kind of the camera? I think the answer will be no, because we've seen with the X-T4 and the X-T3, even though the X-T3 and X-T4 had 10-bit, had a lot of extra features over Sony, the extra refinement that you get from Sony's autofocus, the better lens choices in terms of third-party and first-party lenses, in terms of the Sony E-mount, the bigger battery, the more commonplace nature of Sony relative to Fuji, has kept the A7 III, despite it being far behind compared to the X-T4 in terms of like many features and video. Like, the A7 III still kind of outsells the X-T4 in terms of camera sales. So I think Sony won't be too afraid of the X-T5, because even if the X-T5 has 4K 120 and all that stuff, a lot of people still want the full frame look. A lot of people still want the Sony kind of body. A lot of people still want the Sony E-mount. A lot of people still have Sony lenses. A lot of people still want the Sony ecosystem, because their partners in their video business use Sony. So I think Sony's only threat of 4K 120p, at least in the short term, at least in the 1 year after release of the A7 IV, which will be the X-T5 possibly be released, is highly unlikely to really scare Sony, because I think Sony will probably have seen the X-T3 and X-T4 struggle to compete with the A7 III despite being better in so many specs. So I don't think the A7 IV will have 4K 120p. In terms of like bitrate and all that stuff though, I expect it to have extremely high bit rates, at least 200 megabits per second, all 10-bit 422, all the usual stuff. It will at least match the Panasonic S5, if not be even more, because that is a big competitor for the Sony A7 IV when that comes about. And finally, will it have ProRes RAW over HDMI? Seeing the trend of it, I think it will be the case. The Sony A1 is getting apparently an update to have ProRes RAW added over HDMI, although it's only 4.9K. But I think the Sony A7 IV will definitely have some sort of ProRes RAW external recording support. Maybe it will be only 4K, maybe it will be 6K like the S5, but there will be some sort of RAW support, since that is really the trend that the market is going. Apart from that, I would say that that's about it. Like, in terms of video, photo, all these features, I think I've covered most of it. In terms of like exact screen resolution, all that stuff, I can't figure it. I have no ability to figure it out. But this is my logical kind of guesses as for where the A7 IV might land in terms of its performance, in terms of all that. In terms of price, I think it will be maybe $200, $300 more than the A7 III's original price, kind of in between the R6 and the S5, because the A7C is a thing now, and I don't think Sony would release it at exactly 2,000 USD like they did with the A7 III. So that's kind of where I'm guessing things are going to be. So that's how I think things are going to turn out. Do you think my reasoning is rational? Do you think my reasoning is logical? If you do, tell me in the comments. I would really appreciate it. If you don't, tell me why as well in the comments as well. And argue with me if you have anything you disagree or agree with. And have a nice day. I'll end this video off here. It's been pretty long. See you guys in the next video, which might come out tomorrow, or it might come out never. Goodbye.